I received a letter today that I did not expect to find on my desk. No name at first, no introduction, just a single line that felt strangely out of place, almost like it was trying to disguise its weight behind simplicity. It said, "If you truly care about the future of your son's heart, you should speak now before it becomes too late." I have read many things in my life, messages of opportunity, messages of warning, messages of admiration, but very few make me pause the way this one did, because it was not about money, not about success, not about the world watching him. It was about something far more fragile than any of that. It was about love. And when a man reaches my age, he begins to understand something younger men do not yet fully accept. Success does not protect the heart. Fame does not guard loyalty. Intelligence does not guarantee emotional safety. A man can build empires and still lose himself completely in the wrong kind of love. I have watched my son long enough to know that the world does not always love him for who he is. It loves what he represents. It loves the idea of him. And that is where my concern begins. Because when a man becomes an idea in people's minds, the line between genuine affection and calculated interest becomes dangerously thin, and I have seen what that does to relationships. But before I go further, I want to ask you something directly, because I feel like you are sitting somewhere out there, listening quietly, maybe even relating more than you expected. Have you ever looked at someone you love and suddenly felt unsure whether they truly see you, or just what you can give them? Have you ever trusted a smile only to later wonder if it was ever real? Have you ever feared that love in today's world has become something negotiable instead of something sacred? Have you ever felt that silence between two people can sometimes say more than their words ever did? Have you ever questioned whether loyalty still exists in the way it used to? Now stay with me, because this is not just a reflection. This is a warning I never thought I would need to give out loud. Now I want you to do something simple but important. If this message reaches you in time, take a moment and like this video. Not for me, not for anything else, but because sometimes acknowledgement is the only way we know something is being heard. And if you are listening carefully, subscribe as well, so you do not lose what might be said next. Tell me where you are watching from, because it always surprises me how far human emotion travels across distance. And tell me what time it is where you are sitting right now, because somewhere in the world, someone is awake thinking about love while someone else is asleep taking it for granted. And if this resonates with you even slightly, share it with someone you care about. Not because it is important to me, but because someone in your life might need to hear it more than you realize. Now let me continue. There is something I have observed over the years about relationships involving successful men. People assume the danger is external: attention, pressure, fame, distance. But the real danger is far more subtle. It enters quietly, dressed as affection, speaks softly like understanding, and behaves like it belongs there from the very beginning. I have seen women who could look directly into a man's life and still not see him, only his position, only his future, only his influence. And I do not say this with bitterness. I say it with caution. Because I have also seen the opposite, rare but real, where someone sees the man before the world reshaped him. And that difference decides everything. My son has always lived in a world where intention is rarely pure at first glance. People come with reasons they do not always speak aloud. Some are obvious, some are hidden behind admiration, and some are so deeply disguised that even the person carrying them does not fully admit them to themselves. That is what worries me most. Because when you are constantly surrounded by people who want something from you, you begin to question whether anyone can ever want you without wanting something in return. And that question, once it settles inside a man, does not leave easily. I remember a moment not long ago when I watched him in silence during a conversation he thought I was not fully paying attention to. He spoke about connection, but there was a pause in his voice that did not belong to curiosity. It belonged to experience, to disappointment, to something that had already tested him more than he wanted to admit. And I realized something uncomfortable in that moment. He is not just building things anymore. He is protecting himself while doing it. That is a different kind of weight. And when a man starts protecting his heart more than trusting it, love becomes complicated in ways most people do not understand. I sometimes ask myself whether the world is still capable of offering him a love that does not come with conditions hidden behind polite language. A love that does not slowly transform into expectation. A love that does not confuse admiration with possession. Because I have seen what happens when those lines blur. A relationship can look perfect from the outside and still be collapsing quietly from within. Not because of conflict, but because of imbalance. One person giving too much of themselves, while the other slowly adjusts to receiving without reflection. And that imbalance, once established, is difficult to correct. There is something else I have learned, something that does not get spoken about enough. The more powerful a man becomes, the more people assume he does not need emotional honesty. They assume strength replaces vulnerability, that success replaces companionship, that ambition replaces intimacy. But none of that is true. If anything, it makes emotional truth more necessary, not less. Because without it, even the strongest man becomes isolated in a room full of people, and I do not want that for him. But there is something I have not told you yet, something I have been carrying quietly since that letter arrived. Something that made me question whether I have been looking at all of this from the right angle at all, because it mentioned someone specifically, not by name, but by implication. Someone close enough to matter, someone close enough to change direction, someone I have observed but never fully spoken about in this way. And I have begun to wonder whether I have misunderstood what I have been seeing all along. Because sometimes protection does not look like distance, sometimes it looks like closeness. And sometimes the person you worry about the most is not the one causing harm, but the one trying to hold everything together without being seen for it. That thought has not left me since I read those words, and I find myself asking a question I am not entirely ready to answer yet. What if the concern I have been carrying is not pointing in the direction I assumed it was? And if that is true, then I may need to reconsider everything I thought I understood about what is unfolding around him right now. But I am not ready to say more yet, because there is something still hidden beneath this, something I have not fully uncovered, and until I do, I cannot allow myself to speak it into certainty. Not yet. I did not sleep after that. A man my age is supposed to understand silence. He is supposed to make peace with nights that offer no answers. But there are some thoughts that do not allow rest, no matter how disciplined the mind has become. They sit there, patient and heavy, repeating themselves until you either face them or break under their weight. That letter did not leave me. It stayed with me in a way that felt almost personal, as if it had chosen me rather than simply reached me. Because once you are told that something about your son's heart may not be as protected as you believe, every memory begins to rearrange itself. Every conversation becomes evidence. Every pause becomes suspicious. Every smile becomes something you re-examine in a different light. And that is a dangerous place for any father to be. Because love, when filtered through fear, stops looking like love. It starts looking like investigation. I found myself thinking back over the smallest details. Not the major moments everyone remembers, but the quiet ones. The moments where he said less than usual. The moments where his tone shifted slightly when a name was mentioned. The moments where he seemed present, but not entirely grounded in the conversation. At the time, I did not think much of it. Life moves quickly around someone like him. Distraction is normal. Pressure is normal. Emotional distance is often mistaken for focus. But now I wonder whether I was simply telling myself comforting explanations. There is a difference between a man who is busy and a man who is quietly carrying something he does not yet know how to put into words. And I fear my son has been the latter more than I realized. There is something difficult about watching someone you raised become emotionally independent. You are no longer the first person they tell everything to. You are no longer the one who sees every fracture forming in real time. You become an observer, trying to read meaning from fragments instead of being present for the full picture. And when love enters his life, that distance becomes even greater, because love does not just connect two people. It creates a private world that even family cannot fully enter. That is as it should be. But it also means you are forced to trust what you cannot see. And trust becomes more complicated when you have seen enough of the world to know how often appearances are carefully constructed. I have known people who could speak about love with perfect sincerity while simultaneously planning its end. I have seen relationships built on admiration that slowly turn into silent negotiations. I have seen affection used as leverage, kindness used as timing, and patience used as strategy. And I have learned something uncomfortable from all of it. The most dangerous intentions are rarely loud. They arrive gently. They adapt quickly. They never feel like danger in the beginning. That is why I do not dismiss my unease easily. But there is another layer to this, one I have not admitted even to myself until recently. It is not only what I fear for him, it is what I fear he may already be accepting as normal. There is a moment in every person's life when emotional boundaries begin to shift, when things that once felt unacceptable slowly become negotiable, not because the person has changed at their core, but because experience begins to rewrite expectations. I wonder if that is happening to him, not in a dramatic way, not in a visible breakdown, but in something quieter, something far more difficult to reverse. The acceptance of emotional ambiguity. The acceptance of not fully knowing where one stands, yet staying anyway. The acceptance of love that feels partially secure but never completely safe. And I have always believed that a man like him, for all his strength in building and creating, is still human in the most fundamental sense. He does not need perfection. No one does. But he does need clarity. He needs truth that does not shift depending on mood or circumstance. Because ambiguity, over time, becomes emotional erosion. And I have seen what erosion does. It does not destroy quickly. It weakens slowly until one day something that looked stable simply gives way under pressure it was never designed to carry. There is something else I have noticed in him recently. A change that is subtle enough that most people would miss it entirely. But a father does not look at his child the same way the world does. There is a difference in how he listens now. A slight delay before he responds to certain emotional topics, as if he is weighing not just the answer, but the consequences of giving it. That is not hesitation. That is calculation born from experience. And experience in matters of love is not always a gift. Sometimes it is a burden, because it teaches you what can go wrong before it teaches you what can go right. I asked myself a difficult question the other night. Is he becoming more guarded because he is wiser, or because he has already been hurt in ways he has not fully shared? And I did not like how long it took me to find an answer. Because there are only two possibilities in situations like this. Either he is learning slowly how to protect himself in a healthy way, or he is learning how to emotionally detach while still remaining present. And those two paths look similar at first, but they lead to very different kinds of loneliness. I think about relationships often now, not as stories of romance, but as systems of trust. Systems that require maintenance, honesty, and balance. Most people speak about love as if it is an emotion that arrives fully formed. But in reality, it is something that must be built daily, through choices that often have nothing to do with emotion at all. And that is where I begin to question the world around him. Because I see how easily modern relationships are shaped by perception, how quickly meaning is assigned, how fast attachment forms without understanding, how often people enter each other's lives with expectations already formed before real knowledge exists. And I wonder how many of those expectations are genuine, and how many are projections. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being someone the world already believes it understands. People stop asking who you are and start assuming they already know. And in that environment, even personal relationships can begin to feel like they are being influenced by external narratives. That is a dangerous foundation for love. Because love should not feel like performance. It should not feel like it is being observed. It should feel private even when it is real. And I am not sure that is always possible anymore for someone like him. There is also something I have not said out loud because it feels too specific, too unsettling in its implications. The letter I received did not just suggest concern, it suggested timing. As if something has already moved beyond discussion, as if something has already been decided without full transparency. And when I read that line again and again, I began to feel something I do not often allow myself to feel. Not anger, not fear, but doubt in my own awareness, because it implied that I may not be seeing the full truth of a situation unfolding right in front of me. And there is only one thing more unsettling than the possibility of something going wrong in a loved one's life. It is the possibility that it is already in motion, and you are the last to know. I find myself thinking about the woman involved, though I hesitate even in my own mind to define her role too quickly, because that is another mistake people make. They assign meaning before they understand intention. But I have learned that the truth of a person does not always reveal itself in words. It reveals itself in consistency, in behavior when there is nothing to gain, in presence when there is nothing to prove. And I am now watching for those things more carefully than I ever have before. But what unsettles me most is not what I have seen. It is what I have not yet been allowed to see. Because there are conversations that happen without witnesses, decisions made in private that change the direction of everything. And when those decisions involve love, the consequences are never isolated to two people alone. They extend outward, to family, to trust, to future. And I am beginning to suspect that something has already crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Something that will require a response, something that will force a choice. And I am not sure yet whether that choice will be his, or whether it has already been influenced by circumstances I was not meant to fully witness. There is still more I have not told you. More that I am still trying to confirm before I allow myself to accept it as real. Because if what I fear is true, then this is no longer a matter of observation. It becomes something far more immediate, something that cannot be ignored. And it will change everything I thought I understood about what is happening around him right now. And I am not prepared to say what that is until I am absolutely certain. Because once it is spoken aloud, there is no returning to uncertainty, only consequence. I finally asked for the meeting, not through channels, not through intermediaries, not through the usual structured distance that life has taught me to rely on. I asked directly. Because sometimes a man reaches a point where avoidance becomes more dangerous than confrontation. And what I was told did not bring relief. It brought clarity. There are moments in life when you expect truth to arrive like a single, sharp revelation, clean, defined, contained. But real truth rarely behaves that way. It unfolds in layers, each one shifting the meaning of the last, until you are no longer sure when the truth began, only that it has already changed you. That is what happened when I learned what I was not meant to know yet. The letter was not wrong, but it was incomplete. And incompleteness is sometimes more dangerous than falsehood, because it invites imagination to fill the gaps, and imagination, when driven by concern, rarely chooses the calm explanation. What I discovered was not betrayal in the crude sense people expect when they hear such words. Life is not so simple that it divides cleanly into loyalty and disloyalty, truth and deception, love and manipulation. Those are words people use when they want certainty, but relationships, especially those built around powerful lives, rarely offer certainty at all. What I found instead was something more complicated, a convergence of intentions. And those are far harder to judge. There was care in what she was doing, but there was also calculation. And those two things, when mixed in a single person, create a kind of emotional ambiguity that can either become stability or slowly turn into imbalance depending on what direction it is allowed to grow. I have seen both outcomes in my life. That is what unsettled me. Not the presence of affection, but the presence of structure within it. Because love, real love, does not feel structured in its early form. It does not feel organized around outcomes. It does not feel like it already understands where it is going before it arrives there. And yet, what I was seeing had edges of planning within it, not necessarily malicious, but intentional in a way that made me pause. And when a father pauses like that, it is never without consequence inside his own mind. I thought about my son in a way I had not allowed myself to think for a long time, not as the world sees him, not as the man who builds and leads and carries expectations far beyond what most people will ever experience, but as someone who, at his core, still seeks something every human being seeks, to be chosen without condition, not for outcome, not for presence, not for ability, but for self. And I asked myself a question that stayed with me longer than I expected. When someone enters a life like his, do they fall in love with the man or with the weight of the man? Because those are not the same thing. And the difference between them is not always visible at the beginning. It only becomes visible when circumstances change, when admiration is tested, when pressure increases, when silence replaces attention, when difficulty replaces ease. That is when truth shows itself. And I could not ignore the fact that I was beginning to look for that truth in every detail I could remember. There is a burden in that kind of awareness. Because once you begin to analyze love instead of feeling it, you are no longer inside it, you are outside it. examining it like something fragile that might break under observation. But I could not stop myself, because the letter had introduced something into my mind that I could not unsee. Timing. That was the word that stayed with me most. Not accusation, not fear. Timing. As if something had already reached a stage where delay was no longer neutral. As if decisions had already been made that would only reveal themselves later in stages, not all at once. And I began to understand something uncomfortable about myself in that process. I do not fear love for my son. I fear unnoticed momentum. Because momentum in emotional situations is rarely reversible without consequence. There was a moment during my meeting when something was said quietly that I will not repeat in full detail, because even now I am not entirely certain whether it was meant as warning or reflection. But the essence of it was this. Not everyone who stays close intends to remain in the same position forever. Some people enter lives not to leave them unchanged, but to gradually become part of their direction. And that is not always wrong, but it is not always harmless either. Because influence, when unspoken, can feel like alignment, even when it is slowly reshaping decisions from within. I left that conversation with more silence than answers, and silence, when carried home, becomes thought. Thought becomes memory. Memory becomes interpretation, and interpretation becomes something that begins to feel like truth even before it has been fully confirmed. That is how the mind protects itself when uncertainty becomes too heavy. But I am not a man who can afford to mistake interpretation for fact when it comes to my own child. So I returned not to conclusions, but to observation. And I began watching differently, not with suspicion, but with attention that refused to overlook small inconsistencies. There is a difference between those two states, even if the world does not always recognize it. Suspicion wants to be proven right, attention wants to understand, and I wanted to understand. I watched how he spoke when certain topics came up. I watched how quickly he redirected emotional conversations back toward practicality. I watched the small delays before he responded to questions that were not technical but personal, and I realized something I had not fully admitted before. He is carrying something he has not fully named yet. Not pain in the obvious sense, not joy either, but something in between, something that is still forming its meaning. And when emotions are still forming meaning, they are the most vulnerable to external interpretation. That is where influence becomes most powerful. Because you do not resist what you do not yet fully understand. You adapt to it. And adaptation, over time, becomes identity. I do not say this with judgment. I say it with concern. Because I have lived long enough to know that identity is not always chosen consciously. It is sometimes shaped quietly by what we repeatedly tolerate, what we repeatedly accept, what we repeatedly allow to remain undefined. And love, when undefined for too long, becomes a space where assumptions grow. I found myself thinking about the woman again, not as a problem, not as a threat, but as a presence that is now undeniably part of a system larger than just two people. And systems, once formed, do not respond well to sudden disruption. They resist, they adjust, they defend themselves. And I wondered whether I was now standing at the edge of something that had already stabilized itself internally, regardless of whether I fully understood its structure. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted it to, because it introduces a question every father eventually fears asking. At what point does concern become interference? And at what point does silence become negligence? There is no clean answer to that, only judgment. And judgment, when it involves someone you love, is never entirely free of emotion. That is what makes it dangerous. I have always believed that a man's responsibility to his child does not end when the child becomes independent. It changes shape, but it does not disappear. It becomes quieter, less direct, more observational, but it does not end. And yet there are moments when that responsibility feels like it is being tested by distance I did not create. Distance created by life, by success, by time, by the natural separation that happens when a child becomes someone the world also claims to know. And I am left trying to distinguish between what is truly his experience and what is being shaped around him by forces I cannot fully see. That is not an easy position for any father, because it requires acceptance of partial vision. And partial vision is never comfortable when the subject is love. But there is something I have not told you yet. Something I have been avoiding not because I do not understand it, but because I do. During one of the conversations I was not meant to fully hear, there was a phrase used that changed the direction of my concern entirely. It was not said dramatically, it was not emphasized, it was almost casual, but it carried weight in a way casual words sometimes do when they are not aware of their own significance. It suggested that what is happening now is not the beginning of something. It is the stabilization of something already underway, and if that is true, then I have not been watching the start of a relationship. I have been watching its consolidation, and that is a very different stage, because consolidation means decisions have already been made, emotional positions have already formed, expectations have already been internalized, and reversing anything at that point is no longer about influence, it becomes about consequence. And I am not sure anyone involved fully understands that yet. Not even him. That is what I fear most. Not deception, not betrayal, but emotional acceleration without full awareness of its trajectory. Because once emotion gains speed without clarity, it becomes difficult to slow down without impact. And I do not want impact. Not for him, not for her, not for anyone connected to this unfolding situation. But I am also no longer convinced that avoidance is an option. There are moments when a father must decide whether love means stepping back or stepping closer into discomfort in order to see what others cannot yet see. And I am approaching that moment now, not with anger, not with certainty, but with the uncomfortable responsibility of someone who realizes that understanding may require presence where distance once felt safer, because whatever is happening here is no longer hypothetical. It is active, it is evolving, and it is approaching a point where silence will no longer be neutral. And I find myself thinking one final thing before I allow this to end. If love is truly present here, then it will withstand clarity. But if it depends on ambiguity to survive, then it was never as stable as it appeared. And I am about to find out which one it is.